Hey guys, Samuel Allred here. Welcome back to the Persistence Outdoors podcast. Today we're going back to the basics and talking firearm safety. This is hunting 101 stuff for sure, but it's not just for beginners. Even experienced shooters should review firearm safety from time to time, and we should all keep safety at the front of our mind when we're hunting and shooting. Also, experienced shooters are often the ones who get too comfortable with firearms and unintentionally make safety mistakes. So while these are basic concepts, I think they're equally important for all hunters. Today we'll cover the 4 major firearm safety rules and a number of additional tips, go over some storage options, and even touch on firearm rules for kids. But before that, I want to share the story of the first time I shot a gun, which unfortunately resulted in a dangerous accidental discharge. When I was around 11 years old, I was in West Texas visiting some family, and my dad and uncles decided to go shooting. So all of them and a few of my brothers and I piled into a car, and we went to a shotgun range. This place was actually more than just a shotgun range. It was a sporting clays course, which is kind of like a cross between trap shooting and golf. A sporting clays course will have a number of different positions that you go stand at, and then when you give the signal, a clay pigeon is launched for you to shoot. But unlike trap, you're always shooting from a different position, and the targets can be launched at different speeds and angles. If you're not familiar, clay shotgun targets, also called clay pigeons, are these little discs made of hard clay that are launched like frisbees. They're about 4 inches across and they get going pretty fast, so it's a good way to practice wing shooting. If you hit a clay pigeon with a shotgun, it will shatter, so you always know if you've made a good hit. Some sporting clays even have rabbit targets, which are these thicker discs that are launched on their edge so that they roll and bounce along the ground to simulate a running rabbit. It's pretty cool. It's a great way to get some realistic practice. Anyway, I had never shot a shotgun before. In fact, I don't think I had ever shot a real gun before. I had only shot BB guns before that, but nothing with gunpowder. I watched my uncle shoot, and then it was my turn. I was already a little bit uncomfortable just because of how loud it was, but I had my earplugs in and my eye protection on, and I stepped up to the concrete pad where the shooters stood. I believe we had a safety briefing and had to sign a waiver when we checked into the course, but as my dad handed me the shotgun, he reminded me again to control the muzzle, and I'm glad he did. I remember thinking the shotgun was super heavy. I was always a small kid, and I'm sure the shotgun didn't fit me very well. So I stood there nervously, shotgun pointed downrange, listening to my dad give me some final pointers. My dad stepped away, and all I remember next is the shotgun going off. It was an accidental discharge, somewhere between me attempting to shoulder the gun and well before I called the target, I'd put my finger in the wrong place and pulled the trigger. It scared me to death. Thankfully, the shotgun had been pointing downrange and nobody was hurt, but had I been pointing a different direction, it could have been a real disaster. I'm not sure if the accident was due to clumsiness or negligence, but either way, it could have easily been prevented. The unexpected explosion and the potential danger was equally scary and embarrassing. I just about cried. It was a miserable experience, not a fun introduction to shooting guns. I eventually got back on the horse and shot a few more times, but it pretty much took the wind out of my sails and wasn't very enjoyable. Thankfully, I can say I've never had an accidental discharge again. And on that day, I was following at least one of the major rules of firearm safety by keeping the muzzle pointed in a safe direction. So that's where we're going to start today, the 4 major rules of firearm safety. A quick aside before we jump in, if you enjoy this podcast, please take a moment to rate it 5 stars on whatever platform you listen on. And if you find this information helpful, please share a podcast with a friend. It will help the podcast grow and it will help us get more people outside and into hunting. So, with that, let's get into our 4 rules. Now, these rules are not necessarily in order, and I don't think one is more important than the other because they each build on each other and they're each important. Also, sometimes you will hear different people talk about different lists of rules. Some people will say the 10 rules of firearm safety. These 4 that I have here are the most common rules, and I think everybody can agree that they are the most important. The 4 that I have here are: treat every firearm as if it were loaded, control the muzzle, keep your finger off the trigger until you're ready to shoot, and be certain of your target and what is beyond it. We'll start with treat every firearm as if it were loaded. This one is kind of an umbrella for the other ones. By assuming a firearm is loaded, you're more likely to follow all of the other rules instinctively. If you know you have a loaded firearm, for example, you're not going to point it at someone playfully because you could end up killing them. So assuming that every firearm is loaded and treating it that way is a way to protect yourself and the people around you. Whenever you're handed a firearm, you should check to see if it's loaded first thing, or you should have the person who's handing the firearm to you check and show you. Eventually, checking for yourself will just become a part of your routine whenever you're handed a gun. The next major rule is to control the muzzle. Always keep the muzzle pointed in a safe direction. The muzzle is the end of the barrel that the bullet exits when the gun is fired. And if you have the muzzle pointed in a safe direction, even if the gun goes off, nobody is going to get hurt. This is the rule that saved my bacon when I was first shooting a shotgun. Usually the safest directions to point your gun are going to be up or down, especially when you're outside, because down, you're shooting into the dirt, and up, you're shooting into the air, which isn't ideal, but it's less likely to cause damage than if you're shooting directly at someone, right? Now, up or down is not always the safest direction to point a firearm. If you think about it, what if you live in a multiple story house or you live in an apartment? So I live on the 3rd floor of an apartment. There's nobody above me, but there are people below me. So if I pick up a gun and I'm pointing it down, that's actually an unsafe direction because I'm now pointing it through the floor and there could be people below me who, if that gun went off and if it was loaded, then I could actually end up harming someone. Bullets will go right through walls, right? It depends on the wall and the construction, but a lot of apartment buildings, a bullet, even from a handgun or something, is going to go right through a wall or right through a floor. So you need to be cognizant about what direction is actually safe. If you think about a neighborhood, you might think, okay, I can point this gun up, but you're pointing it up the hill at someone else's house, or you're pointing it out a window and there's other houses over there. So think about what the safest direction is for you to actually be pointing a gun, especially when you're inside and you're pulling the gun out of your gun cabinet or storage and handling the gun. Make sure that you're not pointing it through a wall or through a ceiling or a floor and inadvertently endangering other people. Similar to this idea of controlling the muzzle and always keeping it pointed in a safe direction is to not point it at anything that you can't identify as your target. So if you're out hunting, most people these days will have a scope on their hunting rifle. And it's tempting to want to point your hunting rifle at things so that you can use your scope and identify your target. So you're out hunting and on another ridge, you see movement with your eyes. And you have a 10 power scope on your rifle, so you think, I'll just look through my scope and figure out what that is, if that's an animal that I can shoot. If you do this though, what if it's a person over there? Now you're pointing your gun at this person and you're doing something extremely unsafe. So when you're out and about, make sure to use binoculars, not your optic, to identify targets. Another thing to think about with controlling the muzzle is that a handgun has a much shorter muzzle than a rifle. So I know we don't use handguns as much for hunting unless you are using them for bear defense, but I still think it's worth thinking about. With a handgun, it's much easier to flag someone because of that short barrel. Flag is just the term we use for unintentionally pointing the muzzle of a gun at someone. With a handgun, every little movement you make with your hand covers a lot of area downrange. So if you think about holding a rifle in a safe position, it's pretty easy to tell because the whole gun is oriented in a line, and you have to make some exaggerated movements to get it to point up or down range. With a handgun, you just make a small hand movement and it changes where the muzzle is pointing. So you have to have a lot more concentrated awareness to make sure you're being safe with a handgun. The third major rule of firearm safety is to keep your finger off the trigger until you are ready to shoot. This is the mistake that I made in the shotgun shooting example in the intro. When you pick up a gun, it actually feels natural to put your finger in the trigger guard. If you hold your hand out in a neutral position, kind of like you're holding a glass of water, and then you just relax your hand, you'll see that your fingers are curved, right? So if you were to grasp a gun, your finger is naturally going to go into that trigger guard. So one of the first things that you have to learn to do is to straighten out that finger anytime you're grabbing a gun. And you'll just index that finger along the side of the gun above the trigger guard. Guns do not go off on their own, right? There are vanishingly few exceptions to this, and when it's happened, it's usually because of wear or some sort of malfunction. Many modern guns are built so that they physically cannot go off unless the trigger is pulled. If you think of a Glock actually can't go off because the firing pin is blocked from the primer until the trigger is pulled. So with this in mind, keeping your finger off the trigger is one of the best ways to prevent accidents. When you're practicing shooting, you should always be aware of your trigger finger, and you really should practice keeping the finger off the trigger until you shoot, and then also after you're shooting, taking your finger off the trigger and indexing it along the side of the gun again before you move around and end your shot process. The fourth major rule of firearm safety is to be certain of your target and what's beyond it. You always want to verify that your target is the thing that you want to kill or destroy. Verify that 100% before you even aim your gun at the target. If you can't verify your target, you cannot take the shot. Where I live, there are 4 different types of ungulate species, all in the same area. There's white-tailed deer, mule deer, elk, and moose. And so if I'm out hunting one of those, let's say I'm hunting white-tailed deer, and I see something that looks like a deer, it wouldn't be hard to mix 2 different types of deer up. So before I shoot, I've got to verify what I'm shooting at. It's even more important when it comes to obscured or slightly obscured targets. Think about turkey hunting in the spring, and you just catch a flash of something through the bushes. Well, if you shoot at that, you could very well be shooting at another hunter. So always take the time to verify your target and err on the side of caution. Just as important as knowing what your target is knowing what's beyond your target. Just like when we're thinking about keeping your gun pointed in a safe direction, you want to think about if there are houses, if there are people, if there are roads beyond the target that you're shooting at. If you don't have a good backstop or you can't tell what's beyond your target, you shouldn't take the shot. When I'm hunting, especially if I'm set up somewhere, I'm thinking about this ahead of time. So I know if an animal shows up to my right, I know what's there and what's beyond where that animal could show up. That way, I won't make a mistake in the heat of the moment. So those are the 4 major rules. If you follow those rules, you will be safe in every shooting scenario. But I've got some additional tips for you as well. It's always a good idea to check your barrel for obstructions before you shoot. Just like checking the action to see if the firearm is loaded when someone hands it to you, it's not a bad idea, if you can, to take a look down the barrel and just see if it's obstructed. That way you'll prevent any sort of pressure issues when you actually fire the gun. If your gun has a safety, I don't recommend that you rely on it exclusively, but you should use it as an extra layer of protection. So just because you have your safety on doesn't mean that you can then go and do unsafe things with your gun. If you have your safety on, you can't then go point your gun at people or something like that. But having that safety there is an extra layer of protection, and if your gun has a safety, there's really no reason not to use it. All right, what if you're walking with your gun? As hunters, we'll spend a lot of time walking around with loaded guns. And there's a couple best practices for this. Anytime you're crossing an obstacle, whether it's a fence or a stream or a small steep part of the slope, it's a good idea to unload your gun. Because in those situations, it's easy to flag someone, whether it's yourself or your buddy. So it's a good idea to just unload your gun. You're not going to be making a shot in that instance, right? You have to cross the obstacle before you're ready to shoot again. So there's no reason to have your gun loaded and therefore more dangerous. Also, when you're walking, you really have to be aware of where your muzzle is pointed. There have been times when I'm hunting with people and we're going down a steep slope, and the way that they have their gun slung over their shoulder, it was pointing up at me as I was walking down behind them. So especially when you're out on different types of terrain and in different scenarios, you'll just have to think about what the best direction to have your gun pointing and what the best way to carry your gun is anytime you're walking with it. A final tip is to unload your hunting guns before you store them. There are some guns that you will store loaded for home protection purposes or self-defense purposes, but hunting guns usually aren't being used for those purposes. So the best practice is to just unload them before you put them away. One thing that can be tricky to reconcile is how to follow gun safety rules when you're cleaning a gun, or maybe when you're at the range and you're walking down range to change out your targets, but all the guns are laying there pointing at you from the firing line. How is that safe? Well, in these situations, we're going to clear the gun. So you take the gun, you unload it by running the action, removing the magazine, and then you visually check to make sure that there's nothing else in there. And then you can take a flag, which is a little plastic indicator that you can put in the barrel of your gun from the breech end, from the end closest to you. And when you have that flag in there, it will stop the action from running, and it also shows that there's nothing in the breech end of the barrel. And so now you can visually see that that gun is safe and that it's not going to fire, it's not going to go off. If you have someone else with you, you can also show them the action of the gun and let them check it, and they can see that the gun has been cleared. Then, in the situation at the range, once you step away from the guns aren't going to go off by themselves. So you're using 2 layers of safety. You're clearing the gun, and then you're not touching it. And everybody steps away from the line and nobody touches their guns while people are walking down range. When you're cleaning a gun, you might take the clearing process a step further and actually disable the gun by removing a part. So, a classic bolt action hunting rifle is a good example. When you're cleaning a gun, you'll clear the gun, make sure it's safe, and then you'll just take out the bolt. And now, with the bolt removed, the rifle can't fire. So now you can put the gun down, and once you've cleared it and even disabled it, you can go about cleaning the gun. You can step in front of the barrel if you need to, and the gun is considered safe. Let's move on and talk about storage. Different people are going to have different goals for storing their guns. Some of these goals include keeping your gun safe from unauthorized use, keeping your children safe, keeping your guns safe from theft, and also keeping your guns accessible but secure. There's a couple different ways that you can store your guns. Maybe the simplest way is just to store them in a locking cabinet. If you have a lock on it and it's a sturdy cabinet, it will be hard for anybody to get in and use your guns without your permission. A locking cabinet doesn't necessarily protect your guns from theft. If someone wants to get in there badly, they may find a way, or they could even steal the entire cabinet. So if you need a little bit extra security, you might get a safe. A safe is going to be very heavy, making it hard to steal. It's going to be very hard to break into, and they often have fire protection kind of as an added benefit. If you have a lot of money tied up in your guns, you may want to invest in a safe instead of just a locking cabinet. Now, if you don't have that many guns or you don't want to spend the money on a cabinet or a safe, you can also use trigger locks. And with good trigger locks, you can disable your guns from being fired. This isn't going to prevent your gun from being stolen, but with a high quality trigger lock, you can at least prevent people from using it. There's also security cables which run through the action of your gun, and you're able to lock the other end of the security cable. It kind of looks like a master lock with a little cable on it. These are good, just like trigger locks. They're not as safe as a cabinet or safe, of course, because if someone really wanted to, they could cut the cable with bolt cutters, but it's much safer than leaving the gun without any sort of lock or protection. This isn't so much related to hunting, but if you need quick access to a loaded firearm for protection purposes, you should look into a safe that has a code or uses biometric technology to open. These safes will be very secure because you are the only person who has the code to open it, and you can store a loaded gun in the safe, but also know that you can quickly access it in the case of an emergency. There's lots of reasons to store guns securely, but in my opinion, one of the major reasons to store your guns securely is if you have kids. If you've got kids, you just can't risk having unsecured firearms lying around. It definitely ups the ante. Besides storage and besides teaching the major rules of handling a gun, it may be helpful to teach your kids these 3 rules. Those rules are don't touch, leave, and tell an adult. So if kids encounter a gun and they are not under your supervision, these rules will help them stay safe and potentially get out of what could be a bad scenario. So the first rule, don't touch, is pretty obvious. You don't want your kid touching a gun and accidentally shooting themselves or someone else. The next rule, though, is equally important: leaving the area. Say there's multiple kids around, right? And someone finds a gun and your kid says, I'm not going to touch that, but someone else picks up the gun. Now your kid is in danger. So it's important to tell your kids to leave the area, get away from that gun immediately so that they don't risk getting shot. And then telling an adult is pretty obvious. letting you know so then you can go and do what you need to do to take care of the situation. Well, everybody, those are the major rules of gun safety and some additional tips to keep you and your loved ones safe. I want to wrap up for today with a final thought. Anytime you see unsafe gun practices, you need to speak up. I remember being a kid in hunting, and occasionally I would get flagged. And I'm a pretty agreeable person, and I don't like confrontation. And as a kid, I would just think, well, it's not really their fault. It was an accident. Maybe I should move, whatever. But now as an adult, I understand that that is not a good perspective to have. And it's really important that the other people who are being unsafe understand that they're being unsafe, especially if it's an accident. So if you're hunting with someone and you recognize unsafe behavior, go ahead and call it out. They may not know that they're doing it. They may get defensive. Ideally, they will thank you for calling it out. If I'm doing something unsafe, I want to know so that I don't endanger myself and the people around me. Now, if calling it out is going to create an unsafe situation for you, of course, then remove yourself from the situation. And you may even decide to leave regardless, because if someone is being unsafe with a gun, that is an imminent danger to you and anybody around you. So take it seriously. Don't feel bad about bringing it up. And if you need to, put some distance between you and the person who is being unsafe. That's all I've got for today, guys. Thanks so much for listening. I hope you found something helpful or something new to think about. Until next week, keep shooting safely, and I'll catch you next Tuesday.